An old tale tells of the creation of the Chinese civilization over 5,000 years ago. According to Chinese historian Sima Qian, the period of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors laid the foundation for Chinese society. Though we have different variations of these sovereigns and emperors, the first of these rulers was Fu Xi. He and his sister Nua, the second sovereign, are credited with creating humanity, domestication of animals, and family life. The third sovereign was Xinong, the divine farmer, who gave the Chinese people agricultural inventions and practices, and introduced them to medicinal herbal drugs. Another variation lists the heavenly sovereign, earthly sovereign, and sovereign of man as these 3 legendary rulers. Of the 5 emperors that came next, the Yellow Emperor, or Huangdi, was the first, credited with inventing writing, the bow and arrow, and slew of other ingenious inventions. Most modern Western scholars dispute the accuracy of these stories, but they are viewed as explanations of the Chinese view of family, the shift from nomadic to agricultural life, and the origins of their writing systems. Prior to this, Neolithic China was home to numerous smaller cultures, many based around the Yellow River in the north. The 2 best known to archaeologists were the Yangshao, dating from 5000 to 3000 BCE, which then transitioned to the Lungshan, from 3000 to around 2000. Smaller agricultural societies emerged to the south, around another of China's major rivers, the Yangtze. The southern regions of China were much more wet, so rice was able to be cultivated, while the drier north relied on millet and wheat. It was from these 2 river valleys that Chinese civilization emerged. These regions would remain important, as most of China is not suitable for agriculture. With its wide range of geographical features, like deserts and mountains, not much of China is arable, just a mere 12%. In the west, China's borders were the geographic barriers of the Gobi Desert, Tibetan Plateau, and the Central Asia steppes. These areas were inhabited by nomadic or pastoralist tribes of early Mongol and Turkic peoples, and tribes of Indo-Europeans. Though trade with these folk could be beneficial for both sides, they were generally more aggressive and militaristic. A recurring theme in Chinese history would be the invasions of different nomadic people. Strong Chinese governments often either repelled them or attempted to Sinicize them, making them part of Chinese society. Under weak governments though, these intruders could fragment China, or even take over complete governmental administration. From the south and east though, China remained quite safe from any kind of invasion, until well into the modern era. Chinese historians usually date the start of Chinese civilization to around 2000 BCE, the period after the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, and the founding of the Xia dynasty by Yu the Great, famous for his reported irrigation and control of floodwaters. Many Western scholars consider this dynasty legendary, or conflated with the Erlitou culture, which existed in the same region. After around 400 years, the Xia was replaced with the Shang dynasty. Historians agree on this dynasty's existence, because archaeologists have uncovered the Shang capital at Anyang. One of their finds were oracle bones. These were bones of turtles, chickens, or oxen, that were used as a communication tool with the gods. The inscriptions on these bones were pictographs, and are the direct ancestors of many East Asian writing systems still in use today. The Shang was a monarchy, and ruled through the king's rich aristocrats, who controlled northern China's valuable resources of salts and metals. They also excelled at war. The Shang used the newly introduced 2-horse chariot, similar to the Indo-European invention, suggesting contact between them and the early Chinese, and could even have been used by the Shang in their quest for power. Also found were burial mounds, of the same style as the Lungshan, suggesting lineage to the Neolithic culture. The king divided his kingdom between the aristocratic ruling class, leading to a decentralized kingdom, but the king was able to depose any of these chieftains when he pleased. Defense of the kingdom also fell on the king's shoulders, so he was required to assemble a large army. Once the king died, ritual sacrifices were done at his funeral, including hundreds of his assistants buried alongside him in the royal tombs, as a way to gain the god's favor. Sometimes family members were also sacrificed, but more as a means of following the king and continuing to live on with him in the afterlife. From this, the concept of veneration of ancestors emerged, although later it was modified to burning replicas of objects, which would join the dead on their post-life journey. From what we gather from the oracle bone scripts, the Shang believed they could not only communicate with the gods, but ask for divine intervention. Their most supreme god was Shangdi, a heavenly sky deity. An early Shang character, seen here, represents their word for king. The horizontal lines on the top and bottom represent the divine world and human society, respectively. The middle horizontal line represents the king, signifying his place as intermediary between his people and the gods. During Neolithic China, the social unit was the clan, a grouping made up of many single families. It's likely all residents of a clan adopted the same family name. Houses were generally single-family units, but divisions, like ditches, are seen in villages with multiple clans. This could help explain why today, over 40% of the Chinese population share just 10 surnames. And only 19 surnames are used by around half of the whole Han population, the dominant ethnicity in China. The majority of Shang society were farmers, many of which were peasants who had to work the land owned by the aristocracy. Below them, there was likely a small slave or criminal class. The middle class was small, but included merchants and artisans. Some of these artisans' most iconic metalwork was their bronze casting. They created sophisticated religious objects and weapons out of bronze. Many of these were found in royal tombs. Historians have long believed that the Shang represented the beginnings of Chinese culture, and that from this nucleus, it spread into all neighboring areas. But recent excavations prove that many areas of China already had thriving agricultural communities and bronze works of their own. Many rested in the south, in the Yangtze, but some were in the west. One of these was the Zhou. By 1046 BCE, the Zhou state, which resided to the west of the Shang capital, invaded and overthrew the dynasty. This new Zhou dynasty was the longest in Chinese history, lasting just under 800 years. It is thought the last Shang rulers grew decadent and immoral, losing their people's support, so the takeover by the Zhou was seen as legitimate. The Zhou capital was established in their original territory, near present-day Xi'an. A new capital was later established at present-day Luoyang to take care of affairs further east. Zhou rulers mimicked the Shang, in that the king ruled, but divided his territory between an aristocratic class. Over time, the king's bureaucracy grew, and included ministries for law, education, public works, and religious ceremonies. Sources suggest that since the Shang rulers had become unjust, they had lost the mandate of heaven. The concept is that the king is the medium between his people and heaven. It was his duty to act morally, and with compassion. Not only that, he was to rule efficiently, guarding against droughts, floods, and other natural disasters. Should he fail in this, he was deemed to have lost the mandate of heaven, and could be overthrown, as we saw with the Zhou, who used this to justify their conquest. It would then become part of Chinese politics for the next dynasties, who all took power claiming the mandate. According to Zhou documents, the first part of their reign was a golden age for China. But then, they declined. The aristocratic classes had gained too much power, creating and controlling their own economies, expanding their own militaries, and fighting one another. By 771 BCE, the central government of the Zhou was still recognized, but it was only ceremonial. China entered a time of decentralization known as the Spring and Autumn, and then Warring States periods. Though the political and ruling elite was different, peasants under the Zhou led very similar lives than under the Shang. They worked the fields for their landlords, but were also given fields of their own. This was known as the well-field system. The Chinese character, well, is this symbol, which is divided into 9 segments. This is what the field looked like. The outer plots of land were private, and worked by individual serfs who were able to keep the food. The central, or public plot, was communally worked by the other 8 farmer families, and all food produced here was sent to the aristocrat or landlord, who owned the entire field. From this food, the landlord would send a portion to the king as a tax or tribute. Manufacturing and trade was performed by the artisans and merchants, but they were considered to be owned by the aristocratic class. The actual slaves were most likely prisoners from neighboring regions. They worked labor-intensive jobs, but were probably a very small part of society. Despite the decentralization of the later Zhou period, China experienced high economic growth for centuries. During the final days of the Zhou, in the 200s BCE, the state of Qin undertook a massive project on the Min River, creating a massive irrigation system that watered a large area which could have supported 5 million inhabitants. Impressively, the system is still in use today. The late Zhou was also a time of technological advancement. With the introduction of iron, plows were able to go deeper, and they have since developed other farming techniques. In the wetter south, rice became the food of choice. Despite how long it can take to produce, rice came to replace the other grains, because of its taste and nutritional value. All these advances led China's population to skyrocket to around 20 million during this era. The middle class grew, and along with it, the economy. It soon came to be that the merchants and traders held more power than the aristocratic classes. The most important trade item was silk. There is evidence of silkworms being domesticated since the Neolithic age, and silk material on Shang bronze works and Zhou-era tombs used to wrap the deceased body. These silks, exclusively produced in China, became the basis for a series of silk routes, or the Silk Road, a trade network linking the east to the west. Jade was also an important commodity, having been mined in the mountains of Tibet for centuries. The precious stone was seen as a symbol of purity and virtue. The Chinese, like many other cultures, traded in shells early on, but they transitioned into a money economy, using coins with holes that could be carried on a string, but this was mainly used by the merchant class and those above. The poorer Chinese still bartered, and paid their taxes and rents in grain. During the decentralized period of the Eastern Zhou, many debates and schools of thought emerged, trying to make sense of the world. Though the period had many ferocious battles and bloodshed, it was a golden period for Chinese philosophy. These philosophies were called the 100 Schools of Thought. We know Chinese beliefs originated much earlier, with evidence of Neolithic animism, in which spirits existed in natural forms. By the time of the Shang Dynasty, there was reverence for a supreme god, called Shangdi. As time went on, Shangdi came to be replaced with a less corporeal and more symbolic god known as Tian, or heaven. Some other early concepts were of the yang, the sun, and yin, the moon. These were two primary universal forces for good and evil, light and darkness. Chinese civilization didn't believe one to be more powerful, and that each was to have its own time, just like the day and night. The Shang used oracle bones and divination techniques to try to predict these laws of nature, while philosophers tried to understand it. One of these was Confucius, or Master Kung. Born in 551 BCE, in the state of Lu, during the spring and autumn period, he set out to become a political advisor when he became a young man, and ended up picking up followers on his journeys. His ideas were based in the real world, and he spoke little of the metaphysical, like many other schools of thought. This made most of his teachings, which are compiled in the Analects, focused on politics, ethics, and individual human behavior. He believed the proper way to act was according to the Tao, or the way, each person's individual goals and duties. It is similar to the Dharma in India, a concept we touched on last episode. It was a conservative ideology, as it stressed a hierarchy, but everyone in society was to act according to his or her Tao, including the king, who had the greatest responsibility of all. While his ideas weren't popular during his life, many of his followers spread his message throughout all of China. He never liked the society of his time, wishing to go back to the golden age of the earlier Zhou. This didn't mean all his ideas were old-fashioned. He advocated to open up governmental positions to all men who are capable, instead of only those from noble birth. He still believed the aristocratic class should rule the political sphere though. A revised bureaucracy would develop from the teachings of Confucius, leading to the civil service examination system, a test of merit, not heritage. His philosophy would become the basis for not only much of Chinese society, but East Asian society, for centuries, still remaining relevant today. Another school of thought that became popular during this time was legalism. Mencius, who lived later, expanded on Confucian ideals, and interpreted the philosophy to emphasize the humanistic and compassionate side, stressing that humans were inherently good, and would follow the correct path because of this. Legalists rejected this premise, stressing that humans were inherently evil, and needed to be forced, or coerced into doing their duty. They argued that only a strong central government with strict laws could bring social order, as there was nothing in the universe to make humans choose good on their own. Another alternative to Confucianism, and somewhat more popular, was Taoism. It was founded by a contemporary of Confucius, Lao Tzu, or Old Master. Some scholars claim he was born a century later than Confucius, while some regard him as completely legendary. He is credited with authoring The Way of the Tao, a confounding text full of paradoxes and mystery. Contrary to Confucianism, which preaches obeying hierarchy and working to fulfill one's duties in your place in society, Taoism stressed the Wu Wei, or inaction. Wu Wei was even considered to be the best form of government, as it was a state of perfect harmony. Act spontaneously, and let the natural order take its course. Taoism became a popular ideology for those who felt displeased with the rigid hierarchy and work ethic of the Confucian school. Scholars also became more open to Taoism, especially in the Warring States period, when their world was more chaotic, as if offered a way to cope or accept their place in the chaos. The metaphysical aspects of Taoism dealt with the human spirit, and was more of a religion than a philosophy. Rites and rituals were performed to achieve salvation and immortality, by becoming one with nature. Some practitioners trained their bodies and minds vigorously. Though neither Taoism nor Confucianism stressed the importance of gods, the majority of the Chinese population believed in them and their divine intervention. They also believed that the souls of the dead remained on earth before their afterlife. During this time, family was to perform the specific rituals to care for the spirit, otherwise it would be lost to remain on earth. Unlike other regions of the world, the era of the 100 schools of thought made China a diverse and syncretic society. Both Confucianism and Taoism complemented each other, and both became ingrained in Chinese society. The Spring and Autumn period was followed by the Warring States period, in which 7 major Chinese states fought for power while the Zhou kings were largely ignored. Armies grew and became more powerful, with iron weapons becoming the norm. Foot soldiers, crossbows, and cavalry were widely used. To counter cities building larger fortifications, siege engines were built. One of these states, residing in the original Zhou homeland in the west, was the Qin. It quickly grew into one of China's major powers, through a series of ruthless and unrelenting reforms to their military, agricultural, and economic systems. These were put into place by the statesman Shang Yang. The Qin's position in the mountains to the west gave them a defensive advantage, as well as access to the fertile Sichuan plains. With supreme efficiency, the Qin used this advantage to slowly absorb their rivals. By 221 BCE, the king of the Qin proclaimed himself emperor, the start of a new dynasty, and the beginning of the first unified Chinese empire in history. The Qin solidified its rule under this new emperor, Qin Shi Huang. He had risen to power in the state of Qin back in 247 BCE, having just become a teenager. Adopting the legalist ideology, he swept away his rivals, and became the first emperor of China, a title that would continue on for the next 2,000 years. China under the Qin was quite different from the decentralized Zhou. The state made legalism the official ideology, and banned all the problematic philosophies and free-thinking schools of thought from the last era. Any texts that went against the state, or were seen as promoting dissent, were burned. Many of those scholars against the new state were put to death. The government needed to be strong and was divided into three ministries: the civil authority, the military authority, and the censorate, inspectors who acted as the emperor's eyes and ears, checking government employees for corruption. Any official found guilty of an offense was executed. The emperor also standardized weights and measures, the written Chinese language, and commissioned a road system throughout China. To take power from the aristocratic classes, he divided their land among the peasants, who now paid taxes directly to the emperor. This not only increased revenue, but prevented the elite classes from gaining enough power to fragment China, like under the Zhou. The elites were also forced to live at Shenyang, so that their activities could be monitored. The Qin government also looked at the merchant class unfavorably. Goods were heavily taxed, and much of the commercial and manufacturing activities were placed under government control. Under Qin Shi Huang, the Qin army also marched south, expanding the empire to the borders of the Red River, in present-day Vietnam. China was never much concerned with their eastern or southern borders though. It was the north that was the empire's weak point. Just beyond China, around the Gobi Desert, a confederation of tribes would start to become more active. They were the Xiongnu, a Chinese pejorative term, meaning fierce slave. Historians and linguists still don't know much about their identity, but theories suggest they could be related to either the Huns, Mongols, Turks, Indo-Iranians, or none at all. The region was originally not as dry, and might have been forested, giving early inhabitants plenty to hunt and fish. Once the area became drier, people had to change their subsistence practices, and adopted animal husbandry, and a more nomadic lifestyle. They mastered horseback riding, and traveled seasonally in search of better pastures, carrying with them their belongings, including their homes, called yurts, portable round tents covered in felt or skins. Some of the warring states began building small walls as a deterrent, as their armies weren't equipped to deal with these faster mobile armies. Once Qin Shi Huang became emperor, he added horsemen of his own to his military, mounted archers who could counter the northern tribes. He also extended the walls which had been previously built, using the mountains as natural barriers. Built of granite blocks, the wall, which would become known as the Great Wall, began in Central Asia and ran to the sea in the east. The top was left wide enough for chariots to use as a pathway. Though this Great Wall isn't the one we are familiar with, which was built later by the Ming, this was still a massive undertaking, and a project that cost thousands of laborers their lives. And despite the rumors, there is no evidence human bodies are buried within the wall. Though the empire fulfilled some major historical accomplishments, the brutal legalist system couldn't last. Attempts were made to assassinate the emperor, leading Qin Shi Huang to become quite fearful for his life. He sought out an elixir of immortality, but died in 210 BCE at age 49, possibly poisoned from an elixir of another sort. Justified paranoia often hits deeper than delusions. The emperor's successor couldn't hold the empire together, and by 206 BCE, the Qin Empire was dissolved, after just 15 years. China declined into another period of war, called the Chu-Han contention, but after just a few years, the Han Dynasty was established in 202 BCE. This dynasty would become one of the most successful in Chinese history. This would become a golden age, and the Chinese people would even derive their ethnicity from Han. The empire was founded by Liu Bang, who was from the peasant class, and became Emperor Gaozu. He kept a lot of the centralized institutions from the Qin Empire, but dropped the legalist doctrine, instead adopting Confucianism as the way to govern. Merging it with the remaining legalist governmental institutions, he governed with a system known as state Confucianism. Positions in the bureaucracy were also based on merit, as opposed to inheritance. In 165 BCE, under Emperor Wen, the first civil service examination was given for positions in public service. A school was later opened to train students for these examinations. While many of these students were from the aristocratic class, the examination still acted as a means to prevent those who could not pass from gaining a position as an official. Tax incentives in the Han Empire promoted larger families, so the population rose to what is estimated to be 3 times higher, at just under 60 million, around the turn of the millennium. Over time, wealthy aristocrats and eunuchs, castrated servants of the royal courts, would start to undermine the central government, and eventually play a large role in the empire's eventual collapse. Though the government was still leery of the merchant class, restricting many of their rights, the Han themselves controlled much of the trade and manufacturing. They operated the mines, built and maintained the granaries, and expanded infrastructure, like the road system and bridges. More canals were created, to ease transport over the water all over the empire. Foreign trade was expanded with India and as far as Rome in the Mediterranean, by overland caravans on the trading network called the Silk Road, or Silk Route. Silk itself was exclusively produced in China. Though the Han were proficient at iron working, they were eventually able to produce steel. Paper was also invented under this dynasty, as well as shipyards and shipbuilding innovations that allowed heavy merchant ships to sail against the wind. In the late 100s BCE, China undertook a series of military campaigns to expand the empire. Under Emperor Wu, the Han continued the Qin's expansion to the south, and successfully conquered the Yue tribes of northern Vietnam, annexing multiple kingdoms. Campaigns were also launched to the north and west, stretching the Han's border deep into Central Asia, to subdue the Xiongnu. First, the emperor sent one of his diplomats, Zhongqian, to gather reconnaissance from the region. He returned with valuable information, not only about the economic and political situation of the Central Asians, but also with information about the declining Greco-Bactrian kingdom and Parthian Empire. He also forged an alliance with the Yuezhi, a group of tribes who also saw the Xiongnu as their enemy. The emperor then knew enough about the region to round up and send a military, who secured the area. This region would later become part of the province of Xinjiang, and is today the largest province in China. Being a major presence in Central Asia, the Han were able to trade more with the nomadic tribes and Persia. Silk was of course their main export, and they imported grapes and metalworks. But their most coveted import was the Fergana horse. These horses were native to Iran but were used by other Central Asian tribes. Depicted as large and sturdy, the horses were called heavenly horses by the Han, and Emperor Wu imported and used them as cavalry. The silk that the Chinese exported for all of this was made from threads in silkworm cocoons, as early as the 3000s BCE. By the time of the Han, silk had reached the Mediterranean world via the Silk Road, sparking contact between China and the Roman Republic. During the Roman Empire, silk became quite popular among the upper classes, and they paid for it handsomely, much to the dismay of the Roman emperors. Though state Confucianism was the official religion, at the local level, people either still believed in the old gods, or the spirits associated with nature in Taoism. It was the increase in trade that would introduce an alternative. With the influx of foreign merchants and traders, Buddhism was brought into China for the first time. It didn't take off immediately, as there were no translated Buddhist texts until centuries later, but the spread by word of mouth was the foundation of its expansion. Chinese monks would later travel to India to learn more about Buddhism. Though China's wealth increased, the peasant population was still exploited, leading one Han official to take action. In year 9 of the Common Era, Wang Mang usurped the Han throne and declared the beginning of the Qin Dynasty. Wang Mang abolished slavery and brought back the well-field system. He also launched land redistribution projects. Though his government was more centralized, the peasants and lower classes fared better during the Qin Dynasty. But this alienated the elites. After natural disasters plagued the empire, there was unrest among the peasantry. In 23 CE, he was killed in a rebellion, and the Han regained power. Historians often refer to this period as the Eastern, or later Han. Back in control, the Han started off by lowering taxes and food production increased. Over time though, corruption crept back in, with eunuchs dominating certain rulers, and the aristocracy eventually regaining more land, leading to peasant unrest. This wasn't the only problem, as the Xiongnu again became a threat. After negotiations and diplomacy failed, the Han continued their military campaigns, and by the end of the 1st century, the Xiongnu state was dissolved, and the tribes lost all their power in the steppes. During the 100s, the Han was plagued by many problems, leading to a sharp decline. By 220, the empire finally fell to General Cao Cao, from the Chinese epic written later, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The Three Kingdoms period saw China divided in a state of chaos, massive population decline, and internal and external rivalries. China would remain divided or under threat for centuries, until reunified during the late 500s, to begin its medieval, or mid-imperial period. Daily life in China was always based on the family. During the Neolithic, this family structure was called a clan. In reality, it was a grouping of various different families. During the Zhou, individual families became more important, as they needed to cooperate during agriculture, especially the labor-intensive cultivation of rice around the Yangtze. This made children valuable members of the family, as they were expected to provide their labor in farming, and to take care of their own parents once they grew older. Over time, individual families became the basic social unit. The belief of reverence for one's elders and ancestors was known as filial piety, an idea emphasized by Confucius. At the center of this was the hierarchical system known as the 5 cardinal relationships. The social order was that a son was subordinate to his father, a younger brother to his older brother, a wife to her husband, and all of the family subordinate to the king. The 5th relationship was that a friend was to treat a friend properly. If society respects the filial order, then society should run efficiently. Loyalty to the family or clan, above the state, was a problem for the highly centralized legalist Qin government. They imposed taxes on families with more than 2 adult sons, and tried to break down the clan system, so that loyalty would be foremost to the state. After the Qin, the family had a resurgence under the Han. It was inevitable, as the economy, religious ceremonies, and education were all based on the family unit. Houses were most likely originally built with wood, but eventually brick and tile were used, especially for public spaces and houses for elites. The wealthy also had houses with numerous wings centered around a courtyard, and was meant to be home to several generations at once. By the time of the Han, most houses were either built with wood, mud, or brick. In the northern regions, caves were used as dwellings as well, and would be used continuously for centuries. In most houses, floors were generally mud, and there is no evidence of chairs until the later Sui or Tang dynasty. Clothes weren't anything special, and consisted of wool and burlap in the winter, and lighter clothing in the summer. As for food, rice was the staple for the southern regions, as they were more wet. Millet was the main food in the north. Meat or fish would be added on rare occasions, for a finer dining experience. The upper classes drank ale, but the emperors often looked at excessive alcohol consumption as a concern. Tea was another popular drink. Legend states that the Emperor Shennong discovered tea during the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors period, after tea leaves from a wild tree blew into his water. In reality, tea only became popular much later, in China's imperial period. Once the Qin came to power, urban centers grew and became more important. For easier control, the Qin divided cities into different districts. When the Qin forced the elites to move to Xinjiang for easier surveillance, they lived in large villas and had access to beautiful gardens. Urban centers eventually became the cultural hubs of Chinese society, much like they did in other regions of the world. Here, you could find elites, merchants, manual laborers, even criminals. It wasn't just Confucianism that caused men to be at the top of the family hierarchy. Since the advent of agriculture, men had become more valuable as food producers. In China, women raised the children, while men worked the fields. While the hierarchy was strict, women were still able to attain certain kinds of power, but usually only through their husbands. The Chinese written language also gives us some insight on how they viewed gender roles. Man is composed of the symbols for rice field and power. Woman is from the image of a person with crossed legs. Men were seen as those with the burden of running society, from being governors, scholars, ministers, and warriors. As such, they were allowed to have more than one wife, and could divorce if his wife could not provide a male heir. With no dowry, a woman could become destitute if this were to occur. Unlike the drier climate of Egypt and Mesopotamia, which helped to preserve many of their artifacts and relics, the East Asian humidity had the opposite effect. But archaeologists have found enough to know China had a high level of cultural development. Pottery was found at the Neolithic sites of Yangshao and Longshan. It was during the Shang, though, that bronze works began to appear. Many of these were used during ancestral ceremonies, to serve food or drink. Eventually, some would become decorative. Their crafts were more unique than most other contemporary civilizations, as they used a different technique. Instead of using the lost wax method, China used piece mold casting, which involved different sections of clay placed around a model, then the model removed and the liquid bronze poured in. This allowed them to apply their designs directly to the mold, making it sharper and much more clear. Eventually, the Chinese would use the lost wax method as well, but this brought with it a stark decline in the quality of their bronze works. The work from the Shang is still regarded as the best in ancient China. Another reason for the decline was that China had entered its Iron Age during the late Zhou period, and took up iron making. Though they began the process much later than their contemporaries in the Middle East, they quickly became masters at it. By the time of the Han, the Chinese had invented the blast furnace, a technique that allowed them to reach high enough temperatures to make cast iron. Back west, they were only able to produce wrought iron without this technology. While cast iron was weaker, it allowed for mass production of iron tools for peasants. Bronze casting also suffered because it became less economical. Ceramics and lacquer, a hard coating added to wood and other surfaces, became more popular. These, including iron, were all less expensive to produce than bronze wares. Other art included wall frescoes, much of which has been lost to history. One discovery that has been unearthed was found underground, near the burial mound of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin Dynasty. Inside was a number of stunning terracotta figures representing the emperor's imperial guard, meant to journey with and protect him in the afterlife. Thousands of figures were found in these pits, including warriors, chariots, and horses. The work that went into the figures must have been painstakingly long. Each figure was given different facial features and expressions, and made to represent the different ethnicities that the emperor commanded. The use of these terracotta figures also reveals the Chinese had stopped performing human sacrifice after the death of a ruler, like during the Shang Dynasty, and created replicas instead. Though the human toll was cheaper, the preparations for the emperor's afterlife ended up costing a huge fortune. The mausoleum and tomb of the emperor have still not fully been excavated. We don't know exactly when China developed its writing system, but the earliest evidence we have is from the Shang oracle bones. These were mainly pictographs or ideographs. The symbols, or characters, could look like what they represented, like the character for mountain or water. But they could also represent ideas, such as the character for big, which is a man with arms outstretched, or the character for east, which represents the sun, rising behind the trees. The characters would be given a phonetic sound, and while most other civilizations eventually replaced their pictographs for a phonetic alphabet, China kept a pictographic writing system. This was because of the wide range of Sinitic languages in China. Starting with the Qin, a standardized system was implemented, with all characters having the same meaning, but sounding different phonetically. This made written Chinese accessible to all of China, and is why both Mandarin and Cantonese are different languages, but use the same writing system. In terms of literature itself, the earliest we've discovered is from the Western Zhou period. Philosophical texts and poetry were mainly written in this time. During the Han, when Confucianism became the state ideology, a set of older texts were integrated into the 5 classics, texts which became part of the state-sponsored curriculum. These 5 texts were the Classic of Poetry, a collection of poems, songs, and eulogies; the Book of Documents, a collection of speeches written by early Zhou rulers; the Book of Rites, which describes ancient rituals; the I Ching, or Book of Changes, a fortune-telling and divination text; and the Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle of the state of Lu during the spring and autumn period. It is thought that music was originally invented, not as a means of song and dance, but to purify the heart during ancient rituals. Over time, music became more accepted outside the religious realm. Bells were some of the first instruments during the Shang Dynasty, made from their bronze-making techniques, and struck with wooden mallets. By the Zhou period, these bells were some of the best bronze work in the East. They could be over 2 tons in weight, and produce different notes. They were unique, and would not appear in the West for centuries, and even then, would only be a few inches high. By the late Zhou, bells began to lose favor, and became replaced with string and wind instruments, intensifying the shift from religious music to entertainment. From there, a divergence began from court music, and the pleasurable music of the masses, a distinction which still continues.